and hi everybody, and thanks for giving up your lunchtime for this. I'm going to crack on because it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, really, with 4 key takeaways that I hope might improve your communication. So there are a few interesting tasks to do during the course of this to keep you awake and keep me awake too. So first of all, why should you listen to me? Well, it's a good question. I'm sure there are plenty of people qualified to speak on this topic. For the last 13 years, really, as a journalist that moved into ocean conservation, I became really fascinated with the ways in which in the science community we don't always communicate as well as we could and get our cause across. So in the last 13 years, we've worked with a lot of different organizations running training programs to help with that. So I'm going to move straight on to the stock market. So I don't get the chance to interact with you here. So normally I'd ask how many of you play the stock market. Usually the answer is not many, but there's bound to be 1 or 2 who are familiar with it. The reason I mention it is because if you're familiar with the stock market, there will be a whole bunch of key words that will mean a lot to you. But if you're not playing the stock market, they're words that you recognize, but in the context of the stock market, it makes sense, but it might not make sense in the same way in our everyday lives. I mean, words like, oh, I don't know, let's pick something. Here, common stock might mean something in one language, averaging down, head and shoulders patterns. We think we know what those things mean, but they mean something very specific in this arena. Clearly, a straightforward explanation of the stock market is this: a set of exchanges and other venues where publicly shares are bought and sold. And that's the simple explanation of things. So we can explain things very clearly. We get caught up in our own language. It seems very obvious to us, but this was a very interesting report just recently by an organization called Trajectory. It came out in February of 2024. So it's recent work where they were representing the drinks industry. I'm very interested to find out how the drinks industry should be talking to consumers about taking steps on climate change. One of the takeaways from the report was that the percentage of consumers who completely understand these terms around environmental activism impacts on how well people take action. So you can see, if you can see the graph here, that some things are very poorly understood. I'm always amazed how poorly understood carbon offsetting is, for example, or biodiversity. Only 11, 12% of the public really fully understand what that means. A remarkable number seem to know exactly what net zero means, for example, and recyclable at 54.8% there. It correlates somewhat with this graph, which is a little bit hard to see on the screen, with how well people take action. Now, I suspect some of these taking action things are because they're more easy to do, potentially, but there's definitely a correlation in much of social science between people understanding things and then taking action upon them. And I think this is where we're looking at language. So I wanted to give you a quick task, really, and I'm going to give you 1 minute to do it. So if you could grab a paper and pen, I want you to describe, using whatever language you're familiar with, what you do in your work. Not sort of abstract, but describe what you do in your work in about 30 or 40 words, and we'll come back to this later on in the process. So I'll give you a minute with your paper and pen starting now. Okay, that's the 1 minute up. And so that I don't feel like I'm shouting into the void here, I wonder if does anybody want to unmute themselves and just read out what they've written. Please, somebody do that and help me out with that.
I can go.
Sorry.
Oh,
sure. Thank you.
So I've put that I prepare and create communications around marine science and masts to share this through social media, email, and newsletters.
That's very good. Do you work in communication by any chance? It's very good. Thank you for that. And do one more. Somebody else got one.
I can do one if you want.
Thank you.
I am a stakeholder engager, and this actually means I talk to people who have an interest in whatever area I work in. And this may be by talking to them, noticing what they are doing, and listening. And I do this through meetings, informal places, networking, which means chatting to people, and workshops.
They're both really good. Thank you for that. And I haven't got time to do everybody else, but they're great. So if you could all hang on to that, we're going to rework this a little bit later with some additional information. So thanks for offering those two. So as you can tell, this section is about language, the language that we use. And so the next three images, I want you to, in your head, use a word to describe what you think is going on in each image. And I will flash through them quite quickly. So this is something I would normally do and get people to call out, but I'm conscious of time, so I will sort of move on. Clearly, each of these we're looking at, well, in my view, this is modeling, and computer modeling. And it's a very interesting thing, as I talked about earlier, which is language which works in our arena doesn't always work in others. So there's a lot of work done on this, on looking at the science meaning of words and how the public interpret those words, because we worked a lot with people computer modeling things in oceanography, and then discover that as soon as they say they do modeling, most people are thinking of some other sort of modeling, and we need to clarify that. So this is a very interesting body of work on the science vocabulary. I was always amazed about submarine. You know, sort of everybody in the public would imagine that a ship that stays submerged underwater for extended periods. But of course, for most of us in the science arena, it might mean something just occurring under the sea surface. So there's an important takeaway there, which is words in your area of specialization can mean something very different to the public. There's nothing wrong with using those words, but explaining them, as I think you both did when you read out your things, is really useful to ensure that you're fully understood. So the next takeaway really is acronyms, and it's so easy to slip into acronyms, particularly people in the science arena. I'm not pointing any fingers. I do it myself. So the second one really is try and avoid acronyms at all costs, because they alienate people. They make you feel like part of a club, and it preconceives that people understand exactly what you're talking about, which can have one of many reactions in the public, not least making people angry or confused or just meh, I don't know what they're talking about, I'll zone out. The other one that's fascinating about language is the contrast between Saxon words and Latinate words. Now, if you're British and your British background, you're likely to be using more Anglo-Saxon words in your everyday language, unless you're part of the science community, where Latinate is very much part of the sort of science dialogue, if you like. Now, if you're from outside of the UK, that may be less of a thing, although I think it's still true in much of Northwestern Europe. The fascinating thing here is how much more direct and clear Anglo-Saxon words are, and why they're most often used by journalists and newspapers, because they're easy for people to understand and they're short and direct. Whereas Latinate words, the roots of science language, kind of alienate people in some way and often are better understood with people's different education levels. Let me give you some specific examples here used in advertising. So BMW is the ultimate driving machine, and Stella Artois is my favorite, reassuringly expensive. These are words that are complicated, sophisticated, exclusive, educated, all Latin words themselves, interestingly. And in this case, advertisers want to use it that way. They want to give something an allure of sophistication, and maybe it's aspirational. If you can understand this, if you're drawn to this, you'll want to purchase our product. By contrast, you've got advertising like Nike and Subway and Tesco, which is much more direct. It's much more Anglo-Saxon. It's much clearer to understand. It really is what it says on the tin is the metaphor for that. So it doesn't mean that this is what we have to use in science. It's just an illustration of the way in which actually the public are familiar with certain words and actions and language and respond to them way better. So the interesting thing about language and jargon, I suppose, that the takeaway from this is what we think we say is not always what others hear. That you need to explain the terms you use. You don't have to dumb down. I mean, with the Latinate words, astonishing numbers of young people and kids, I was one of them, know the scientific names of dinosaurs, but it's possible to learn those things. But for adults, they need explaining. They need an additional bit of information that makes them feel better about that word. And using direct words can certainly help. it depends on your audience, of course, which is if you're wanting to influence scientific colleagues, you use scientific jargon, language, Latinate words. If you're speaking to decision makers, politicians especially, but also the public, more direct language is what they're likely to respond to best. So that's the first of the key things I was going to go through. Let's move on to another, which is really the way in which we tell stories. So there's a formula, really, isn't there, for the way that scientists, engineers, people in the science arena study things, research things. You can see the box on the left there. This is way in which the process that we tell stories works. Interestingly, the TED Talk phenomenon has really tried to overcome that, and it's tried to sort of turn things a little bit on its head. So in TED Talks, it's very typical to have this narrative arc. It usually begins with presenting the idea. There's other elements that go into it too, but the next key thing will be describing your evidence, your data, the story, present the idea, then describe it. And then eventually what would be the new reality if the idea is adopted. And it's very formulaic. It tends to be repeated in most TED Talks, not all of them. I've certainly looked at quite a few, and it's a thing that works, and that's why people use it. So performing a narrative arc really helps all of us get our heads around things. Humans have a 40,000 or more year old tradition of telling stories. We are used to things having a certain way that they perform, the way that we are receiving that information. It's very different to the way that generally within the science dialogue people communicate. One interesting way to look at the narrative arc is the elevator pitch. Now, for those unfamiliar with that, that would be in the time you've got to go up in an elevator with a friend, a colleague, a decision maker, a member of the public, and they ask you what you do. Can you describe your work in that elevator 1 floor, 2 floor time and make it very short and sweet, but understandable? So the narrative arc for an elevator pitch is problem, solution, result. And this has come from a book called The One-Page Marketing Plan by Alan Dibb. And I've been using this for a very long time now for myself. So when we look at it, it really breaks down very similarly to the way in which a scientist might approach things. There's a problem there in the right-hand corner, and then somewhere between methodology and findings might be the solution. What's the way in which we're going to tackle this problem? And then number 5 here, the implications might be, what's the end result? What might happen as a result of tackling that problem? So, for example, I'll be sort of shameless here. The elevator pitch we have for our own organization, problem, solution, result, tends to be the problem is our environment is facing huge threats, but decision makers, the public, don't always grasp the science. The solution is that we run training and events, so we're helping scientists to communicate better. And then self-servingly, the result is that people at big institutions tell us that we really improve the way they present their work. Now, I'm not doing this as an advert, but it's just to illustrate what is the problem that you address in your work, what is the solution you provide, and what is the result. And it fits very nicely with so many of the traditional 7 storytelling methods that I haven't got to go into, in that nearly always in narrative arcs, look at a Pixar movie. There's normally day-to-day things are happening and everything's bumbling along nicely, but then there's a problem. And somebody has to solve that problem, and the narrative resolves in some way with a result at the end. So it's used by Disney, by Pixar, by many, and it might be a way in which to frame what you do in your work in a way that gives you a bit more of a narrative arc. So I thought it might be interesting to take the text that you've already written. I'm going to give you a little bit longer on this one, so maybe sort of 2, 3, 4 minutes, something like that. So let's see how we're getting on for time. We're doing pretty well. So as an elevator pitch, describe again, take that text of what you do, and these 3 bullet points, problem, solution, result. Can you reframe what you do in terms of what's the problem that you are addressing in your work? What's the solution you're providing? How do you do it? And then what's the result? What's the outcome really of your work? So let's give you 3 minutes or so starting now. Okay, let's see if we can wrap up this bit. Again, it'd be really nice if one or two people were happy to read out what they've got here. Is anybody happy to unmute and do that? I can see Phil raising a hand here. Please, Phil.
Yeah, so I went with problem is that MASTS is a large organization across multiple institutions in Scotland. And although some of them work together, they don't all work together all the time. Because it's so large. Solution is to provide a flow of comms so that people can find out about what others are doing, and as well as promote opportunities across the community as a whole. And the result is an increase in engagement, collaboration, and networking opportunities.
That's really good, Phil. Nicely done. Really good. Anybody else got one, please? Is that Sophie, please? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, hi. Human activities are changing the way the ocean behaves, but we don't exactly know how. I use computers as a virtual test tube of the ocean to see how it is changing and how that might affect us. Knowing this will help us prepare for the future.
It's really good. I really like it. And I really like the, I don't know if you've used that test tube analogy before. It's really good.
Yeah, that's my go-to.
A good one. Nice one. Anybody else? So we've got time for a couple more, I think. Is that, am I pronouncing it right? Is it Kiara?
Yeah, it's Kira.
Kira, sorry,
Irish
Kira.
spelling, which
Nice.
yeah, no one ever gets right.
My apologies.
No, not at all. Yeah, so I found it hard to be concise, but here we go. Anyway, I said many people are not engaged with their local coastal environment and do not understand how their lives influence on the ocean and how the ocean influences them. We work with local communities via events focused on learning, well-being, and taking action to improve people's connection to the ocean and their understanding of the ocean and their health and well-being. We now have a very engaged and diverse community who state that they're interested in the ocean more than they were previously.
It's really nice, Kira. I really like the arc. You got everything in there. And if I'm going to be picky, I'm not being picky at all. I hope you don't take this personally, because I would pick on myself too. Is trying to get rid of some of the words, isn't it? Because it's such there's such a lot to say in one floor in the elevator. But it's really good. I really like what you did. I think it's strong.
That's something definitely in terms of the multiple parts of it, of understanding well-being, of taking part in events. I was like, it's too much. So that's really useful feedback. Thank you.
Well, yeah, I hope it is, and that's how it was intended. And I've had to learn it myself the hard way as a journalist, which is you give people the headline version and assume they're so intrigued they'll want the detail. So if you can condense that down to something even punchier, you'll tease people enough to think, oh, really? Tell me more about that. And that's when you've got them. So really well done with it. So
thank you.
And one more, maybe. Everybody always goes for, I hate being on the microphone. I have to be on the microphone and the camera, which is even worse. So anybody else want to read out one? Feel free to unmute.
I can if you like.
Thanks, Chrissy.
I have too many words already. So my problem is not enough communication between sectors. Knowledge doesn't reach decision makers and vice versa. Solution would be enhancing communication through inter and transdisciplinary projects, also social events. And the results, ideally, better understanding, better and faster decisions and solutions, and more general outreach.
It's good. It's good. Lots of Latinate words in there, but but it's really hard to remember to do both things, isn't it? But I think and I it may be that for all of you, Chris, you did really well with that, and maybe you've used that before, because I think you've all done really well with it. But if it's new to you, reframing all those words into some sort of narrative and addressing the problem first always helps people grasp things. So I thought that worked really well for you there, Chrissy. Cool. Well, I'm going to move on. They're good, and I want you to, as you can imagine, to rework with those later on. But the next thing I want to do is a quick quiz. And you only have to jot your own answers down here. But it's kind of like well, it's unfair on Chrissy, maybe some of other in the room. Who are we, the British? So how well do you know the British people? So here's Here's a quick series of questions. Just jot your own answers down. I won't be testing you. That's even better, isn't it? So I won't know whether you're right or wrong, but it might be fascinating to learn yourself how accurate you are. So what percentage of the UK population do you think are pensioners? I won't delay it too long. It's 19%. So 19% of pensioners are pensioners. These are all from a recent poll from the podcast. The rest is politics, and the details there of the sample size, etc., and how it was weighted. I will send you this presentation at the end if you're interested, so you can go and bury into the detail. Let's go on to the next one. What percentage of the UK earn more than £100,000 a year? That is 8%. Which I found surprising, but that's I'm not going to tell you which way I found it surprising. Which percent of the UK are ethnic minority? 18% of the population ethnic minority in the UK. Next one, which percentage of the UK are university graduates? 37%, which I'll be honest was higher than I expected for that one. And which percentage of the UK live in urban areas? And that is 84%. So 84% of the UK population live in urban areas. So it's fascinating how well do we understand the people that we're talking to. In this case, I'm looking at the British population, and just imagine within those different percentages whether any of those sectors you have to speak to and whether you realize where they come from. Clearly, a lot of people's experience is their lived experience. You know, the EDI, equality, diversity, inclusion, is one of the things that makes a huge difference to them, their outlook, what they've been through, what they have to do in their lives, whether they're disabled, a person of color, all sorts of things can affect people's sense of who they are and how we might address them. We also have people, of course, we live in an age of alternative facts. So we have people who somehow have adopted positions that many people in the science community will struggle to understand, or how to speak to people who hold diametrically opposite views to ourselves. So this really is the third section. We're looking at social values. Now, for anybody here who knows a bit about social science, I apologize, because this is really much a social science 101. It's a very basic introduction. If you haven't thought about this, of how the values that people hold, and I say people, but I mean you, me, everyone else on this webinar, we're all different, but particularly the people that we have to speak to. It's whether and how these people will listen to you, because their lens that they're listening to you through will be different to mine, different to yours, and they'll be affected by their life experience or their age or their income level or all those other things. There are lots of ways you could look at social science. This, as I said, this is a beginning. I've worked on some on the Engaging Environments Project, which was a NERC-funded initiative. A number of consortia worked together. We worked with this set of details, progressive activist Sigurd Pragmatist. You can see all the detail on the left there. One of the social values that breaks down the UK population into these categories. The link is on the screen, but I'll send the presentation to you if you're interested. So it's a huge area, and that's one way of looking at it. I've also looked at it through cultural dynamics. Cultural dynamics, and this book by Chris Rose, who is a former Greenpeace campaigner, is a more elementary introduction, but it's often used, or has been used in the past, by the marketing industry, segmenting the population according to certain values, designed by people who are marketing the shoes you're wearing, the shirt I'm wearing, the things that I buy, this pencil. They're figuring out what my values are and why I will want to buy those items. So it clearly works. But the fundamental underlying of cultural dynamics and many other things is Schwartz's theory of basic human values. And some of you may well be familiar with this. If I give a very glib version of it, I apologize, but time's not on my side. But Schwartz's work really segmented people according to the values that they hold dear. And it's really underpinned by Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And many of you will be familiar with this, which is really the essence of it. For those who don't know it, is that we need to have the essentials in our lives before we can turn our attention to morality, creativity, meaning, science, such like the things that seem far away from can we eat tonight, find shelter, have clothing to wear, and we work our way up through the hierarchy of needs. So Schwartz's theory of basic human values builds upon that, but effectively asks in a survey a series of questions that teases out at a point in your life, not that you are set with these values forever, at a point in your life, what is it that's important to you? And you end up plotting these values on a sort of a chart like this, spread across in different segments, loosely categorized by Schwartz in terms of self-direction, universal and benevolence at one side. Over on the left there, you've got stimulation, hedonism, and achievement. And then further down in the bottom right-hand corner, conformity, tradition, security. There's clearly a lot of overlap. For all of us, none of us fit in one category. We have multiple values across here, but sometimes, and for many of us, our values tend to cluster in particular segments on the chart here. And it's a snapshot. It's a snapshot of you, me, anybody at a time in our lives, or reflective of our upbringing, and we can change. We may change in our lives and become more conformist, as people often do when they get older, or we may become more financially comfortable and afford to do other things with our values. So Schwartz's theory of human values is the underpinning really of the European Social Survey. So it's very well recognized. Almost every national academic funding body uses the data every 2 years to look at this, and it's much more complex than I'm explaining here. But this is the gist of it. This is what this work is used for, to look at populations and attitudes and the way that you, me, and everybody on this webinar are responding to things. And there are these clusters. So let's do a little simple bit of social science and look at the clusters on the chart. So if your values are around conformity, politeness, let's read a few out here, social order, sense of belonging, national security, being humble, accepting my portion in life. If these are things that are reflected in the way that you've addressed the questions in the survey, you could argue that people have these values at their core. There's a segment of the population for whom being cautious, security-minded, law-abiding, patriotic, a sense of belonging, very much your home is your castle and you want to take care of you and yours. There's a segment of the population for whom those values are more important than the other values. These are not their only values, but this segment, they value these things in particular. Another part of the chart you may remember had a lot more hedonism, achievement, and power in here. Now, if I was going to give you a really glib, say, version of this, Donald Trump would fit very easily in this section, but clearly people much less extreme than Trump, myself included. There's some values there: enjoying life, hedonism, pleasure, ambitious. I can't deny some of those things are part of my makeup too. Some people carry it to extreme, but if generally speaking, people pick a lot of values in this part of the chart here, then you could characterize them as being very interested in their own public image, material things. It's still quite fitting in, needing to blend in. These people tend not to be the sort of outliers in society, if you like, but the sort of early adopters of things rather than the inventors. But recognition and being ambitious is part of the characteristic of people in predominantly fall in that part of the chart. You can't divide the population up into 3 segments, as I'm going to show you, but I'm just trying to give you a bit of a primer to think about your audience. So the final section I was going to talk about are the people interested in universal and benevolence. Look here at world peace, a spiritual life, privacy, unity with nature, equality, protecting the environment. So the section here would have these sort of values: innovators, very holistic, looking at global partnerships, questioning things, driven by issues very often, and relationships, and are quite curious. And so if we kind of glibly break the population down into these segments as we've described, we've got a whole set of people interested in tradition and conformity. Their main values are around that. They have others too. Some others much more interested in their public image and achievement, and those interested in universalism and environment. The fascinating bit here is that when these surveys are done, populations can shift. In the 1980s, in the sort of Margaret Thatcher years when Britain was making a lot of money, a lot of people fitted into the hedonism achievement sort of section of the chart. A lot of people were getting rich quick. And so the percentage was higher. We currently live at a time where people are fearful. And around 70% of the UK population is sort of fitting into the bottom right-hand corner of conformity, tradition, security, and quite fearful, concerned about the cost of living, wanting to protect their homes and their families. Interestingly, when we're talking about environment, which is what the topic that's held dear by all of us on this webinar, it's about 10% of the population. 10% of the population hold these values more highly than the others. It doesn't mean the others don't care about environment. It doesn't mean that it's not ranking somewhere or 5th, 6th, 7th in terms of their priorities. It's in there somewhere. Climate change in some recent surveys goes across the board with all these groups. But for the 10% interested in universalism, it's very high in the list. So the challenge for us is that mostly we address our conversations. I'll make that an I statement. We are tempted to address our broadcasts, our messaging, to people that think like us. And in fact, people interested in environment first are about 10% of the population. So we can use language which misses out a lot of these people. So if we take this group here, the very cautious, sort of law-abiding group, and I'm going to give you a sort of shorthand here, which is somewhat trite, really, but it's useful, I think. Much of their news content is going to come from sources like the Daily Mail, the Daily Express. The views that they hold towards climate, oceans, environment will be shaped or will be reflected by these sort of publications. If we take the next group, which is sort of very sort of public image driven, technological, if you like, then the Elon Musks of this world or the Ideal Home magazine or the Hello might well be the sort of things that their priority is to read those sort of content. And with apologies for being very glib about all this, then, you know, the sort of bleeding heart liberals like myself interested in environment and science, then, you know, New Scientists and Our True Sentient might well be of those three things, which would I read? It would be that one. But it means that my messaging, if I'm not careful, is going to focus on that group rather than the other groups. So the long-winded point I'm making is, how would you talk about environment to the other two groups, or indeed all three? So I'm going to give you 1 minute to think how you would sell the benefits of solar panels to each of those groups. So we'll give you 1 minute starting now. So we're coming up on that 1 minute. So I'm going to, I won't invite anybody to speak here because I'm conscious that we've got a couple of other things I want to get done first. But let's kind of go through it together, and you can compare what you've written with the way I explain things. So for the first group and solar panels, the very traditional group, I would develop a narrative around safety, security, and saving money. You know, you're away from the vagaries of the energy market. The power goes down and the apocalypse comes. You've got your own source of electricity. You can defend your family. What's more, if you can afford to install the panels, you'll be saving money over the long term. So there'll be a lot of safety, security, saving money issues around that. For those who these are their predominant values, there's some overlap, as I keep wanting to stress, between all of them. There may be other things that you've thought of too, because there's much to unpack with that. The group very interested in their public image. Well, of course, there might well be a thing there about solar panels look cool because the neighbors can see you've got them. There's an apocryphal story that in some housing estates that are wealthy, people put solar panels on both sides of the roof, even though one roof never sees the sun. I think that's a little bit unfair, but let's take that as a trite example of there are ways in which people want to impress. Look for technological solutions, particularly to our climate crisis, and look good with the neighbors. Adopting new technology, showing off that you can afford these things too is the thing, or the neighbors have got it, so we want it too. And the last group, of course, this is me here. I can't say whether it's you, it might be, but it's, you know, you want to do it because it's also the right thing for the planet. Of course, I can identify with all of these things. I've got a moving home, which is why my house looks so bare at the moment, and the place I'm going to, I want solar panels because we want to save money. want to do the right thing by the planet, and I also want to adopt technologies I think might help. So, of course, we do things for multiple reasons, but if you're marketing solar panels to these people, don't try and market it to the group interested in safety and security and say it's the right thing for the planet, because they won't see that as in their top priorities. So it's, can we adopt in our messaging ways that would appeal to all three groups? So that's just before I pop onto that. So it's relevant really for the text you've written about yourself. So if you were to review what you've written with your sort of narrative arc, your problem, solution, result, is there any tweaks to the language that you would make if you were describing it to people in that elevator that you think, I need to make sure it doesn't alienate people? I mean, for example, I'll give you a really simple example. Just by including the word British at some point in your narrative, you'll get the ear of the left-hand group here who might otherwise zone out if you're just talking about global issues and planet. It sounds very simplistic, and it is, because there's a much more sophisticated approaches to take, but there are trigger words or ways in which newspapers would frame things that people respond to. And I'm desperately keen that we in the science community, the environment community, don't miss a trick and don't alienate effectively what is 90% of the UK population by not using simple tweaks of the language that would make all the difference. So this is the final exercise, and it's about you. So there are 3 tasks to do, and I will start by getting you to take a piece of A4 paper, and can you draw 2 rectangles like this on it? So effectively, it doesn't really matter what it looks like, but you need it looking something like this with your paper and pen or pencil. And once you've got this drawn, I've got 3 one-minute exercises to do. So the first of these exercises is in the center rectangle. I want you to write some words about you, the things you're interested in, the hobbies that you have, the things that are important to you, what you do in your personal life, in your private time, things that maybe you don't normally talk about in your work environment. So write some words or draw, if you prefer, whatever you're comfortable with. I'll give you 1 minute starting now to put those words in there. Okay, you know how this works. I normally ask somebody if they don't mind reading them out. So is there anybody who hasn't been, who doesn't mind coming on the microphone and reading what they've put in there? Or is there anybody who's already spoken doesn't mind doing it? Because I know some people might not be keen to do it. So somebody doesn't mind reading out the words they've put in there. Phil, thank you.
Sorry, I couldn't find a pen and paper, so I'm kind of just going off the top of my head.
That's even better.
So I would say science communication is a big thing for me. So presenting, talking about science is something I generally really enjoy doing. I also have a lot of craft hobbies like crochet, so I'd probably put crochet in there. And nature, getting outdoors and being away from, town, cities, and actually somewhere in a bit more of the sticks.
That's great. Thanks, Phil. Anybody else happy to read out theirs? Chrissy.
Oh, that's not fair.
Sorry. Chrissy Ingle.
Oh, God.
Okay. Are there 2 Chrissies, are there? Okay.
There are, apologies. Yeah, I can't see everybody on the screen at once. So yeah, my bad.
I love talking to people. I love my dog and my family and friends. I'm completely into gardening. I enjoy my holidays, and I love the beach. Nice.
Thanks, Chrissy. That's great. And I saw Kira put your hand up as well, didn't you, Kira, at one point? Do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. So I put scuba diving, football, family, friends, festivals, music, art, marine conservation, social justice, the beach, having fun, and connecting with others.
You sound like the worst scientist in the world.
Yeah.
That's really good.
Not a scientist by trade, so that's probably why.
And I was being very rude and joking, so I hope you don't mind me saying. Next task, you'll be pleased to hear there's one more. In the diagram that you've drawn, the next rectangle, so Phil, you have to imagine a rectangle here. I'd like to talk about your area of expertise in your job. What's your specific thing that you tend to do, work and study in a little bit of detail? So I'll give you 1 minute to come up with what you do, write words about your area of expertise in the next rectangle. Okay, so is anybody happy to read out what they put in there and the area of expertise rectangle? I don't mind hearing from you, Phil, because you're having to keep it in your head.
Yeah, so I put my areas, I would say, is designing content and audience engagement.
Very good. Anybody else? Chris Ingle.
Sorry, it takes me a while to find the unmute. Marine science application, stakeholder engagement, and translating policy for others.
Nice, thank you. That's really good. Anybody else want to throw something in? Okay, and I'll move on to the last section. So in the final outer rectangle, can you write some words about the big issues, environmental issues, but they could be other issues that you think we as humanity should tackle? So I'll give you 1 minute to think of those big issue words around the outside. Okay, is anybody happy to read out a few words? It'd be good to hear from a couple of you. Kira, thank you.
Yeah, sorry, speaking a lot, but
It's fine.
this
It's
is really
good.
interesting. I was like in the flow of writing my long list, and so I've probably got more, but the first ones I wrote were environmental issues, climate change, poverty, social justice, capitalism, and gender inequality.
Nice, thank you. That's really helpful. So, Phil.
I wrote fake news, polarized opinions, poor or biased education, and action prevention.
It's a nice combination between the two of you. That's okay. That's good. I'll move on to this really, which is you can see that the big issues often can feel generic and hard to tackle. But your story is unique. The interesting is when you describe what your personal interests are or hobbies, it's so much easier for people to relate to you in the science arena when they're not in the science arena. And evidence clearly shows when people do surveys on this that when they can relate to the scientists, they'll listen much more to what you have to say about the big issues, which can feel very generic. And people, I think the acronym I always pick is MEGO, amigo. My eyes glaze over because it's very hard to think how you would tackle those things. So you and your story is a fascinating thing. Phil, have you still got your hand up for a reason, or am I just... I don't want to talk over you. That's good. So to wrap up really with that section, I love this quote from Auden, who was a great sort of poet, playwright, writer early in the sort of 20th century. In order to be a scientist, an artist, a doctor, a lawyer, you have to be a human being first. And I think it's so easy that the scientific discipline drives that out of the way that we communicate. Very often scientists talk about the data was gathered, not I went out in a boat and gathered data in the following way, and which is legitimate. That's the scientific discourse. It's to remove observer bias. But actually what the public audience want, what politicians often want, is to hear from somebody who has an interesting backstory, the human interest story, and they're much more likely to listen to the science. So it's kind of been a rapid whirlwind, really, and there's clearly much more I could cover on this and in more detail. But if you take the narrative that you've started to craft, your elevator pitch about yourself, and we're able to do this checklist of 4 things. Go through the words. Watch your words. Are there words in there? Are there those scientific words, Latinate words that could do with a bit of simplifying or explaining, not dumbing down, just to make sure you're not misunderstood? The next was the one on the right, which is the narrative arc, where you've each begun to shape that. Can I tell my story about myself, or in a presentation, or anything else that I do, in a narrative that clearly makes sense to people? Next would be the Schwartz theory of basic human values. Are there ways in which I can tweak my language so that people in those segments of society wouldn't normally bother to listen to the scientific discourse or conservation or environmental messages, might respond a little bit better. And the final element that you've just done, which is how much of you are you comfortable bringing into the story? Because if you do, it'll transform the way in which people bother to listen to the narrative. As opposed to it being dry, you sort of become the star of your own story, which is very uncomfortable for most people in science. You don't have to make yourself uncomfortable, but are there elements to which why you're passionate about something has driven you to take that up as a career, and why you care and why they should care in the same way? So I've had to rush through a lot there. Feel free to email me via Chrissy or directly on there if you'd like a copy of this as a PDF. It has many of the QR codes and links there. And I hope some of that is a value to you. There's a lot more we could cover.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Ian. That was a great talk, very interesting, and love the interactive part as well. And thanks everyone who very lively took part in the chat and all the actions. We do have a couple of minutes left for questions if you do have them. I'd be happy to forward slides after. We had one question in the chat by Kira. I'll just read that out. She says it's really fascinating and helpful. And a question would be, how do we bring in the desire to educate in our comms and avoid putting people in silos? For example, reinforcing stereotypes. Or is this not the place to consider those things, and that would come after the initial engagement?
Yeah, I think that would be my takeaway as a journalist, which is spark the initial engagement and then enlarge upon that. It's very hard with either putting people in silos from a social science perspective, or indeed putting people in silos from a scientific discipline perspective. But I think that's often the secondary part. I'm sure there's more we could expand upon that face to face if we were chatting, but that would be my initial reaction to that.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much. Yes, please unmute yourself if you have a question, or put it in the chat. I'd be happy to read it aloud.
And thanks for the very kind comments from some of you. It's really what I hope is, because as a journalist is and passionate about the subject, I've been all my life, is how can we do our best to get everybody else as committed and infused and not zoning out when we deliver our messages.